Sarah Chen settled into seat 9C on Flight 447 from Denver to her hometown of Cedar Falls, Iowa. The small regional jet was packed with holiday travelers, their excited chatter filling the cramped cabin. She pulled her worn baseball cap lower over her eyes and tried to disappear into the thin airline seat. At 28, Sarah looked younger than her years. Her slight frame and quiet demeanor often made people underestimate her. What they couldn't see were the scars hidden beneath her long sleeves, or the weight she carried in her dark eyes. After 3 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic, she was finally coming home for good. The businessman in 9A glanced at her with barely concealed annoyance. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I think you're in my seat. This is first class." Sarah looked up, confused. "No, sir, this is economy. First class is up front." She showed him her boarding pass. C9C. The man whose expensive suit and gold watch screamed corporate executive huffed loudly. "Well, I paid extra for legroom. A young girl like you doesn't need all this space." He gestured to the emergency exit row where they sat. "I'm sorry, but this is my assigned seat," Sarah replied quietly, her voice steady despite the familiar knot forming in her stomach. She'd faced down enemy fire, but civilian confrontations still made her uncomfortable. A woman across the aisle turned around, her perfectly styled blonde hair bouncing as she joined the conversation uninvited. "Oh honey," she said to Sarah in a sickeningly sweet tone, "why don't you just move? Mr. Patterson here is a platinum frequent flyer. Surely someone your age can squeeze into a middle seat somewhere else." More passengers began to stare. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she held her ground. "Ma'am, I reserved this seat for a reason. I have a medical need for the extra legroom." The businessman, Patterson, let out a harsh laugh. "Medical need? What could someone your age possibly need that for? Gaming, injuries." Several passengers chuckled at his joke. Sarah's jaw tightened. The titanium rod in her left leg, inserted after an IED explosion that killed 2 of her fellow soldiers, chose that moment to send a sharp pain up her thigh. But she wouldn't give these people the satisfaction of knowing they'd hurt her. "I'd prefer not to discuss my medical issues in public," she said quietly. "Oh, how convenient," the blonde woman chimed in. "Probably just trying to get a free upgrade. I've seen girls like you pull this act before." A man in uniform, Sarah could tell he was military even in civilian clothes by his posture and short haircut, started to stand from a few rows back, but his wife grabbed his arm and whispered something that made him sit back down, shaking his head in disgust. The flight attendant, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, approached with obvious reluctance. "Is there a problem here?" Patterson immediately turned on his charm. "Yes, this young lady is in the wrong seat and refusing to move. I'm sure you can sort this out. I fly with this airline constantly." The flight attendant looked at Sarah's boarding pass, then at Patterson's. "Sir, she's in her correct seat. You're in 12A, that's ridiculous." Patterson's face was turning red. "I specifically requested an emergency exit row. I have platinum status. I'm sorry, sir, but seat assignments are final. If you'd like, I can see if there are any other available seats once we're airborne." Sarah watched as Patterson's anger escalated. She recognized the type men who weren't used to being told no, especially by women. In her experience, backing down only made them worse. "This is unacceptable." Patterson was now standing, looming over Sarah. "I demand you move this child to another seat. I have an important meeting tomorrow and I need to be able to work." The blonde woman nodded vigorously. "Exactly. Some of us are contributing members of society. We shouldn't have to suffer because of entitled young people who think they deserve special treatment." Sarah felt something crack inside her chest. The familiar weight of being dismissed, of being seen as less than, settled over her like a heavy blanket. She thought of her team, members who didn't make it home, of the night she'd spent holding dying soldiers while mortar exploded around them. She thought of the medal sitting in a box in her mother's attic, the one she'd never told anyone about. "Fine," she said quietly, starting to unbuckle her seatbelt. "I'll move." The military man in the back row shook his head and muttered something. To his wife, a teenage boy with kind eyes looked like he wanted to say something but was silenced by his mother's stern look. Sarah began gathering her small backpack, the only luggage she'd brought home with her. Everything else she owned had been shipped separately or left behind at the base. As she stood, her leg buckled slightly, the long day of travel and stress making the old injury act up. She caught herself on the seat back, but not before Patterson noticed. "See, I told you something was off with her," he said smugly to the blonde woman. "Probably on something." The flight attendant looked uncomfortable but didn't intervene. Sarah could see other passengers watching, some with sympathy, others with the same dismissive look she'd grown accustomed to. In their eyes, she was just another difficult young person causing problems. What none of them knew was that their pilot, Captain James Rodriguez, had been listening to the commotion over the intercom. 20-year Air Force veteran, he'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan himself. Something about the young woman's voice, her calm responses, despite obvious provocation, reminded him of the soldiers he'd flown on countless missions. As Sarah prepared to give up her seat to keep the peace, Captain Rodriguez made a decision that would change everything. He stepped out of the cockpit and walked down the narrow aisle, his captain's uniform commanding immediate attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in a clear, authoritative voice that carried through the cabin, "is there a problem here?" Captain Rodriguez's presence immediately shifted the energy in the cabin. His tall frame and graying temples gave him natural authority, and his calm confidence made even Patterson straighten up slightly. "Captain," Patterson began, his tone now more respectful but still demanding, "we're just trying to resolve a seating issue. This young lady is being quite difficult about moving to accommodate passengers with status." Sarah looked up at the captain, expecting the same dismissive treatment she'd received from everyone else. Instead, she saw something different in his eyes, a measured assessment that reminded her of her commanding officers. He was actually looking at her, not through her. "Miss, may I see your boarding pass?" Captain Rodriguez asked politely. Sarah handed it over, her hand trembling slightly. The captain studied it, then looked at her face more carefully. Something flickered in his expression, recognition of some kind, though Sarah was certain they'd never met. "And you are?" he asked Patterson. "Robert Patterson, Platinum Elite member. I fly over 100,000 miles a year with this airline. Surely someone of my status shouldn't have to deal with this kind of inconvenience." The blonde woman leaned forward. "Exactly. Some of us actually contribute to society. We shouldn't have to accommodate every entitled young person who thinks they deserve special treatment." Captain Rodriguez's expression hardened slightly, but his voice remained professional. "Ma'am, everyone on this aircraft has paid for their ticket and deserves to be treated with respect." He turned back to Sarah. "Miss, you mentioned having a medical need for this seat." Sarah nodded reluctantly. "Yes, sir. I have some mobility issues, service-related." The question was asked quietly, but it carried weight. Sarah's eyes widened. How could he know? She glanced around at the watching passengers, feeling exposed. Yes, sir," Patterson scoffed. "Oh, please. Now she's claiming to be military. What's next? Stolen valor. She looks like she's barely out of high school." The captain's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He'd seen this before: young veterans, especially women, being dismissed and disrespected by people who had no idea what they'd sacrificed. "What branch?" he asked Sarah. "Army, sir. Combat medic." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Tours 3, sir. Afghanistan." A heavy silence fell over the nearby passengers. The military man in the back row was now paying close attention, his expression shifting from frustration to interest. Patterson, however, wasn't deterred. "Anyone can claim to be military. Where's her proof? I bet she's just another millennial trying to get sympathy points." Captain Rodriguez studied Sarah's face more intently. There was something about her that nagged at him, not just her military bearing, which was subtle but unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for, but something else. Her calm under pressure, the way she'd handled the confrontation without losing her temper, the quiet dignity she maintained even while being humiliated. "What was your unit?" he asked. "4th Brigade Combat Team, 10th Mountain Division, sir." The captain's expression changed suddenly. He knew that unit well. They'd been involved in some of the heaviest fighting in the Kunar province. His mind raced back to mission briefings, casualty reports, and one particular commendation that had crossed his desk. "Your name?" he asked, though something in his tone suggested he was beginning to suspect. "Chen, sir. Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen, Captain." Rodriguez felt the pieces click into place. He remembered now the after-action reports, the Medal of Honor recommendation that had crossed his desk when he was stationed at Bagram, the medic who'd single-handedly saved an entire platoon under heavy fire, who'd refused evacuation until every wounded soldier was stable, but he needed to be sure. "Chen," he said slowly, "do you have a call sign?" Sarah's eyes met his, and for the first time since boarding, she stood a little straighter. "Yes, sir. What is it?" Sarah hesitated. Her call sign wasn't something she shared casually. It carried too much weight, too many memories, but something in the captain's eyes told her he already knew the answer. "Angel, sir. They called me Angel." A murmur ran through the cabin. Even Patterson seemed to sense that something significant was happening, though he didn't understand what. Captain Rodriguez nodded slowly. Angel of Q. No, it wasn't a question. The military man in the back row audibly gasped and started to stand, but his wife pulled him back down. Sensing this moment was bigger than their intervention, Sarah's composure finally cracked slightly. You know about that, Staff Sergeant Chen, Captain Rodriguez said, his voice carrying a new tone of deep respect. Everyone in theater knew about that. What you did at Firebase Charlie. He shook his head in amazement. Ma'am, you saved 37 men that day. Patterson looked confused and increasingly uncomfortable. What are you talking about? What firebase? The captain ignored him, his attention focused entirely on Sarah. The enemy had overrun the perimeter. 3 KIA 14 wounded, and the medic was down. You came in during a full assault, under direct fire, and spent 6 hours treating wounded while calling in airstrikes, on your own position. Sarah's eyes were bright with unshed tears. I was just doing my job, sir. No ma'am, you were doing everyone's job. You held that position until the QRF arrived. The after-action report said you refused evacuation 3 times because you wouldn't leave wounded behind. The cabin had grown completely silent. Even the flight attendants had stopped their preparations to listen. They nominated you for the Medal of Honor, Captain Rodriguez continued. I processed some of those reports myself when I was at Bag. You turned it down. Sarah nodded. My team didn't make it home. Didn't feel right to take credit. Patterson was looking increasingly pale. The blonde woman had gone completely quiet, staring at Sarah with a mixture of shock and dawning shame. Captain Rodriguez straightened to his full height and looked around the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, you are in the presence of one of the finest soldiers I've ever had the privilege to know about. Staff Sergeant Chen didn't just serve our country, she exemplified the very best of what service means. He turned back to Sarah. Ma'am, with your permission, I'd like to make an announcement to the entire aircraft. Sarah looked uncomfortable. Sir, that's really not necessary. I don't want any special treatment. It's not special treatment, Staff Sergeant. It's respect. Something you should have been shown from the moment you stepped on this aircraft. Captain Rodriguez picked up the intercom handset, his finger hovering over the button. He looked at Sarah one more time. You sure you're okay with this? Sarah glanced around the cabin. Patterson had sunk into his original seat in row 12, his face flushed with embarrassment. The blonde woman was staring at her hands, no longer meeting anyone's eyes. But Sarah also saw other faces. The teenager who'd wanted to speak up earlier was watching with admiration. The military man in the back was holding his wife's hand tightly, and several other passengers were looking at her with newfound respect. Yes, sir, she said quietly. The captain pressed the button, and his voice filled the entire aircraft. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez speaking. Before we begin our flight today, I want to share something with you about one of our passengers. Sarah felt her cheeks burn as every head in the plane turned toward the front. She wasn't used to being the center of attention, especially for something she considered just doing her duty. We have with us today Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen, United States Army, who served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a combat medic. On March 15, 2019, at Firebase Charlie in the Kuna province, Staff Sergeant Chen single-handedly saved the lives of 37 soldiers during an enemy assault that lasted 6 hours. A collective intake of breath swept through the cabin. Sarah could see passengers craning their necks to get a look at her when the firebase came under heavy attack and their medic was killed. Staff Sergeant Chen voluntarily entered the combat zone. She treated wounded soldiers under direct enemy fire, coordinated medical evacuations, and even called in airstrikes on her own position to break the enemy assault. She refused evacuation 3 times, stating she would not leave wounded soldiers. Behind the captain's voice carried clear pride and emotion. Her actions that day saved 37 lives. She was nominated for the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration, but declined the award, saying her fallen teammates deserved the recognition more than she did. Sarah was fighting back tears now. She hadn't talked about that day in years, had tried to bury it, along with the guilt she felt for surviving when others didn't. Staff Sergeant Chen returned home 2 weeks ago after completing her 3rd tour. She carries injuries from her service, including wounds received during the action I just described, so when she tells you she has a medical need for an exit row seat, she's earned that consideration 1,000 times over. Patterson was now staring at the floor, his face red with shame. The blonde woman had tears streaming down her cheeks. Captain Rodriguez continued, I'm proud to be flying Staff Sergeant Chen home today, and I want every person on this aircraft to know that your freedom to travel, to complain about seating arrangements, to live your daily lives without fear, exists because people like her stood between you and those who would take those freedoms away." He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "Staff Sergeant Chen, on behalf of this crew and every American citizen on this aircraft, thank you for your service and your sacrifice." The response was immediate and overwhelming. The military man in the back row started clapping, and it spread like wildfire through the cabin. Passengers were standing, applauding, many with tears in their eyes. Even the flight attendants were wiping their eyes as they joined the ovation. Sarah sat frozen, overwhelmed by the response. She'd spent so long being invisible, being dismissed, that this recognition felt surreal. The teenager who'd wanted to help earlier was clapping enthusiastically, mouthing thank you to her. An elderly man across the aisle saluted her with tears streaming down his face, but it was Patterson's reaction that shocked her most. The businessman who'd been so dismissive stood up slowly, his expensive suit wrinkled, his face a mask of shame and regret. He walked over to Sarah, the entire cabin watching in silence. "Ma'am," he said, his voice barely audible, "I owe you an apology, a massive apology. I had no right to speak to you the way I did, no right to assume anything about you." He paused, struggling with his words. "My son is deployed in Syria right now. Army infantry. If someone treated him the way I treated you..." He couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah looked up at him, seeing not the arrogant businessman from earlier, but a father worried about his child. "It's okay," she said softly. "You didn't know." "That's no excuse," Patterson replied firmly. "There's never an excuse for disrespecting someone the way I disrespected you. Would you... would you allow me to buy you dinner when we land? It's the least I can do." Before Sarah could answer, the blonde woman appeared beside Patterson. Her makeup was smeared from crying, and she looked devastated. "Please," she said to Sarah, "please let me apologize to... I said horrible things. I made assumptions about you that were completely wrong. I'm ashamed of myself." Sarah looked at both of them, then around the cabin at all the faces watching this moment. She thought about the anger she'd carried for so long, the frustration of being misunderstood, of having her service dismissed or ignored. She thought about her fallen teammates and what they would want her to do. "Apology accepted," she said. "Simply, both of you." The relief on their faces was palpable. Patterson returned to his assigned seat without another word, and the blonde woman did the same. As the applause died down and passengers began settling in for takeoff, Captain Rodriguez approached Sarah one more time. "Staff Sergeant," he said quietly, "I'm upgrading you to first class, and I don't want to hear any protests. You've earned it, and besides, my crew wants to take care of you on this flight." Sarah started to object, but something in his expression stopped her. "Thank you, sir. That's very kind." "It's not kind, it's right." And Sarah, he used her first name for the first time. "Welcome home," as she gathered her things to move to first class. Passengers throughout the cabin nodded to her, smiled, offered quiet thanks. The military man in the back row stood as she passed and offered a crisp salute, which she returned instinctively. But as Sarah settled into the comfortable first-class seat, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something bigger. Captain Rodriguez had recognized her not just as a veteran, but specifically as the Angel of Kunar. That suggested her story was more well known than she'd realized. What she didn't know was that Captain Rodriguez had already made a phone call. Before takeoff, the local news station in Cedar Falls was going to be very interested in the hometown hero who was finally coming home. The flight to Cedar Falls was the most comfortable Sarah had experienced in years. The first-class seat cradled her injured leg, and the flight attendants treated her like royalty without making a big show of it. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed in that moment when Captain Rodriguez spoke her call sign. As they began their descent into Cedar Falls, the flight attendant, whose name tag read Margaret, approached with a warm smile. "Staff Sergeant Chen, the captain asked me to give you this." She handed Sarah a handwritten note. Sarah unfolded it and read, "Your story isn't over. Sometimes the hardest battles are the ones we fight at home. Don't give up, Captain Rodriguez. P.S. Check Channel 7 News tomorrow morning." The note puzzled her, but before she could think about it too much, the plane was touching down on the familiar runway of her hometown airport. As they taxied to the gate, Sarah noticed something unusual through the window: news vans in the parking lot, and what looked like a small crowd gathered near the terminal entrance. "Oh no," she whispered to herself. Somehow, word had gotten out. Margaret appeared again. "Staff Sergeant, the captain wanted me to let you know there are some reporters outside." He said to tell you that if you want to avoid them, he can arrange for you to exit through the crew door. Sarah considered it. The last thing she wanted was media attention. She'd come home quietly on purpose, hoping to slip back into civilian life without fanfare. But then she thought about Patterson and the blonde woman, about how they'd changed, their entire perspective in just a few minutes. Maybe her story could help other people understand veterans better. No, she said finally. I'll go out the regular way. But thank you. As Sarah gathered her backpack and prepared to deplane, Captain Rodriguez appeared one last time. Staff Sergeant, it's been an honor flying you home, and Sarah, your mother is waiting outside. She's very proud. Sarah's eyes widened. My mother, how did she? I may have made a phone call, the captain said with a slight smile. Sometimes people need to know their heroes are coming home. Sarah walked through the jetway on unsteady legs, her mind racing. She hadn't told her mother exactly when she was arriving. She'd wanted to surprise her. But as she emerged into the terminal, she saw a familiar figure standing with the small crowd of reporters. Linda Chen was 62 years old, barely 5 feet tall, and one of the strongest people Sarah had ever known. She'd raised Sarah and her 2 brothers as a single mother after their father died in a car accident when Sarah was 12. When Sarah had enlisted against her mother's wishes, Linda had been heartbroken but supportive. Now, seeing her daughter, for the first time in 8 months, she was beaming with pride. Sarah, Linda rushed forward, and suddenly Sarah was enveloped in her mother's arms, breathing in the familiar scent of her perfume and feeling like a child again. Mom, how did you know? Sarah whispered. A nice captain called me an hour ago. Told me my daughter was a hero and was coming home. Said I should be here to meet her. Linda pulled back to look at her daughter's face. Why didn't you tell me about what happened over there, about what you did? Before Sarah could answer, a reporter approached with a camera crew. Staff Sergeant Chen, I'm Janet Morrison from Channel 7 News. Could we have a word with you? Sarah tensed, but her mother squeezed her hand. It's okay, honey. Tell them about my brave girl. The interview was brief but powerful. Sarah, standing beside her proud mother, spoke quietly about her service, about the team she'd lost, and about how veterans often struggle with recognition and respect when they come home. She didn't go into graphic detail about Firebase Charlie, but she spoke about the importance of supporting soldiers when they return from deployment. We don't serve for recognition, Sarah said, looking directly into the camera. We serve because we believe in something bigger than ourselves. But when we come home, sometimes we're invisible. Sometimes people make assumptions about us based on how we look or how old we are. Today, on that flight, I experienced both the worst and the best of how veterans can be treated. Janet Morrison nodded. What would you want people to know about veterans like yourself? Sarah thought for a moment. That we're just people. We've seen some hard things. We've made some sacrifices, but we're not looking for special treatment. We just want the same respect anyone else deserves. And maybe, if you see someone who seems young or different, don't assume you know their story. You might be surprised. After the interview, as the crowd began to disperse, Sarah and her mother walked toward the parking garage. I'm proud of you, Linda said suddenly, not just for what you did in Afghanistan, but for how you handled yourself today. Your father would be proud too. Sarah felt tears threatening again. Mum, I need to tell you something. I'm not okay. Coming home has been harder than I expected. I've been struggling. Linda stopped walking and turned to face her daughter. No, honey. I could hear it in your voice during our phone calls. That's why I'm glad that captain called me. You don't have to struggle alone anymore. As they reached Linda's car, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. She opened it and saw the news report. If you're interested in helping other veterans transition home, call me. We need people like you, Captain Rodriguez. Attached was contact information for a veterans advocacy organization that helped former service members navigate civilian life and connected them with resources for housing, employment, and mental health support. Sarah showed the text to her mother, who smiled knowingly. Sounds like your story is just beginning, not ending. That evening, as Sarah sat in her childhood bedroom, she reflected on the day's events. In the space of a few hours, she'd gone from being dismissed and disrespected to being recognized and honored. But more importantly, she'd been reminded that her voice mattered, that her experiences could help others. She looked at Captain Rodriguez's contact information again, then at the medal box sitting on her dresser that her mother had kept all these years. For the first time since coming home, Sarah felt like she had a purpose beyond just surviving. She picked up her phone and started typing a text message to the number Captain Rodriguez had given her. This is Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen. To know more about how I can help, The response came back within minutes. "Welcome home, Angel. Let's talk tomorrow." 3 months later, Sarah stood in front of a packed auditorium at the Cedar Falls Community Center. The audience was a mix of local veterans, their families, community leaders, and curious residents who had followed her stories since that day at the airport. She adjusted the microphone and looked out at the faces watching her, no longer feeling the familiar anxiety that public speaking used to bring. In the front row sat her mother, beaming with pride. Beside Linda was an unexpected guest, Robert Patterson, the businessman from Flight 447. He'd kept his promise about dinner, but it had turned into something much more meaningful. Patterson's company had become a major sponsor of the veterans advocacy organization Sarah now worked with, and he'd become one of her strongest supporters. 6 months ago, Sarah began, her voice steady and clear. "I was just another veteran, trying to figure out how to be a civilian again. I was angry, lost, and convinced that nobody understood what veterans like me were going through." She paused, looking at Patterson, who nodded encouragingly. "I was wrong. People do care. They do want to understand. They just need someone to help them see past their assumptions." The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. Sarah had become a powerful speaker, able to bridge the gap between military and civilian communities in a way that few people could. Today, we're launching something new here in Cedar Falls. The Angel Project isn't just about helping veterans transition home. It's about helping our entire community understand what service really means. It's about creating connections between people who might otherwise never understand each other. She gestured to the side of the stage, where a banner displayed the Angel Project logo, a simple design that incorporated both military and civilian elements. "We're going to pair veterans with local businesses, not just for employment, but for mentorship and understanding. We're going to bring high school students together with veterans to learn about service and sacrifice. And we're going to make sure that no veteran in this community ever feels invisible or forgotten." The applause was thunderous. Sarah waited for it to die down before continuing with the most important part of her presentation. "But this project isn't just about veterans helping civilians understand us, it's about veterans helping each other. Because the truth is, some of the hardest battles we fight are the ones nobody can see." Her voice grew more personal, more vulnerable. "I came home from Afghanistan carrying more than just physical injuries. I carried guilt about the soldiers. We lost anger about feeling unappreciated, and fear that I'd never find my place in the civilian world. I was drowning, and I was too proud to ask for help." In the audience, she could see other veterans nodding, recognizing their own struggles in her words. That day, on Flight 447, when Captain Rodriguez recognized me, it wasn't just about military honor or public recognition. It was about being seen, really seen. And it reminded me that our stories matter, that our experiences have value beyond the battlefield. Sarah looked directly at a young veteran in the third row whom she'd been working with for the past month. Marcus had been struggling with PTSD and substance abuse since returning from Iraq. Today was his first public appearance since starting treatment. The Angel Project is going to provide support groups, job training, housing assistance, and mental health resources. But most importantly, it's going to provide community, because none of us should have to fight our battles alone. As she spoke, Sarah thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. After that first phone call with Captain Rodriguez's contact, she'd been connected with Veterans Bridge, a national organization that helped former service members transition to civilian careers in public service. They'd offered her a position running a local chapter in Cedar Falls. The work had been challenging but fulfilling. Sarah had spent the last 3 months visiting with local veterans, building relationships with community organizations, and working with mental health professionals to create comprehensive support programs. She'd also been going to therapy herself, finally addressing the trauma she'd been carrying since Afghanistan. "We're not looking for sympathy or special treatment," Sarah continued. "We're looking for understanding, for opportunity, and for the chance to continue serving our communities in new ways." She gestured to the back of the auditorium, where Captain Rodriguez stood with his wife. He'd flown in specifically for this launch event, and his presence meant everything to Sarah. "Someone once told me that our hardest battles are often the ones we fight at home, but battles are easier when you're not fighting them alone. The Angel Project is about making sure no one has to." Sarah concluded her presentation by introducing the team that would be running the various programs. Patterson took the stage to announce his company's ongoing support, including funding for a new Veterans Resource Center. The mayor presented Sarah with a key to the city, officially welcoming her home and recognizing her contributions to the community. But the moment that meant the most came after the formal program ended. A young woman in military uniform approached Sarah hesitantly. "Staff Sergeant Chen, I'm Private Lisa Martinez. I'm being deployed to Afghanistan next month, and I wanted to thank you for showing me what it means to serve with honor, both overseas and at home." Sarah looked at this young soldier, seeing herself at 18, full of determination and nervous energy. "Private Martinez, you're going to do great things, and when you come home, we'll be here to support you." As the evening wound down and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah found herself standing with Captain Rodriguez and her mother outside the community center. "I'm proud of you, Angel," Captain Rodriguez said, using the call sign that had changed everything that day on the plane. "You've turned a moment of recognition into a movement of change." Sarah smiled, feeling a peace she hadn't experienced in years. "Thank you for seeing me that day, for speaking up when I couldn't speak up for myself." "That's what we do for each other," he replied. "That's what service really means." Linda Chen hugged her daughter tightly. "Your father would be so proud of who you've become. Not just the soldier, but the woman you are now." As they walked to their cars, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, the young veteran she'd been mentoring. "Watched your speech online. Starting my first day at the new job tomorrow. Thank you for not giving up on me," Sarah typed back. "Thank you for not giving up on yourself. That's where the real courage is." Looking up at the stars above Cedar Falls, Sarah thought about the path that had led her here, from the battlefield in Afghanistan to that airplane seat, from feeling invisible to becoming a voice for change, from fighting battles alone to building a community of support. She wasn't the same person who had boarded Flight 447 6 months ago. That young woman had been carrying her service like a burden, something to hide from a world that didn't understand. Now Sarah carried it like a bridge, connecting her past with her future, her pain with her purpose. The Angel of Kuna had found her way home, not just to Cedar Falls, but to herself, and in doing so, she'd lit a path for others to follow. Angel Project would go on to help hundreds of veterans over the next few years, expanding to other communities across the Midwest. Sarah's story would be featured in national media, inspiring similar programs around the country. But none of that mattered as much as the simple truth she'd learned that day on Flight 447. Everyone has a story worth telling. Everyone deserves to be seen. And sometimes, all it takes is one person willing to speak up to change everything.